Morality forms the basis of many of the attacks against atheism on YouTube. The gist seems to be that without a god, morality must be subjective and therefore relative, and that a relative morality is no morality at all. The claim then is either that atheists are bad people, and or that if there is a morality, there must be a god to provide its foundation. Of course, stating that subjective morality is undesirable does not establish that that is not the case. Reality does not conform to our preferences. Also, to say that atheists must therefore be bad because they reject the theist account of morality is not a valid attack against the atheist account, because it presupposes the truth of the theist account. Essentially, it is a premise that presupposes its conclusion. Many atheists do attempt rebuttals at these attacks, but I'm sorry to say that they don't always make a very convincing case, often citing evolution as providing us with morality. While I agree that evolutionary theory provides good explanations of why we have the capacity for moral action, statements of behaviour useful for survival and passing on genes do not themselves carry prescriptive weight. You cannot derive a moral imperative from that kind of statement of fact. It is far more interesting, and perhaps profitable, to look instead at just what the theist claims are and what they entail. The implications of what we find are far-reaching indeed. First of all, there is the assumption that if moral value is subjective, it must be relative. I'm not going to dwell on that much here. Suffice to say that they make no attempt to establish the assumption, and that it is still a contentious issue. For myself, I suspect that morality is both subjective and absolute. Secondly, and far more importantly, there is the assumption that only God can provide a foundation for an objective morality, implicit to which is the assumption that God can provide a foundation for objective morality. Again, theists make no attempt to establish these assumptions in their arguments. Before proceeding further, let's make clear what we mean by objective and subjective value. By objective value, we are talking about the moral position called moral realism. It states that moral values exist in the world independently of our own existence or perception of them. Subjective value, however, is something that comes from us. It is how we experience and engage with the world. It is the difference between I value, subjective, and this is of value, objective. So, what is it about God's commands that entail we should obey them? It is not enough to say that God is our creator. Think of the Frankenstein story. Ought the monster to obey Victor simply because he created him? No, that is not enough. For God's will to carry prescriptive weight, we must recognize that God's will is good. Long ago, the philosopher Plato wrote a dialogue between his teacher Socrates and Euthyphro, an Athenian of high standing thanks to his perceived piety. Socrates asks Euthyphro, "What is piety?" Euthyphro starts to answer by listing the sorts of acts accepted as being pious. Socrates stops him, however, and says, "No, those are just instances of piety. I want to know what is piety itself. What is it that makes all these things pious?" Euthyphro answers that pious acts are pious because the gods will them. Socrates then asks, "But why do the gods will these things?" To which is answered, "Because they are pious." The point of this little story is that to describe God's will as good, the term good must refer to something other than God's will. Else we will simply be saying that God wills what God wills, a tautology that fails to instill God's will with any prescriptive value. This means then that good must be something anterior to God and cannot be of God's creation, as that would identify it as God's will. Logically then, if moral realism is correct, then God cannot be its foundation. This renders ethics an essentially secular study and practice. Now, I want to take this a little further. I want us to look at what this means for the definition of God by itself and in conjunction with the problem from evil. The problem from evil is an argument against the existence of God, pointing out that the evil in the world is incompatible with God's being good. The merits and rebuttals of this argument will have to be the subject of another video. For the time being, I'm going to accept that the argument is valid. We need now to look at how monotheism defines God. There are two types of definition. The first, God is that than which I can conceive of nothing greater. The second is as a list of qualities, being the creator and sustainer of all things, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. We should first note that all of the elements of the second definition are entailed by the first definition. Logically, God must be the creator of all things. However, the fourth element of the second definition is entailed by the first only if there is an objective standard, that is, if moral realism is true. Now, if moral realism is true, then we have an ontological problem for the existence of God. If moral value is objective, it cannot be of God's creation. Therefore, it exists in contradiction to the definitions of God. Under the first definition, this is necessarily the case. If moral realism is true, then God cannot exist. And if God exists, then moral realism cannot be true. The two are mutually exclusive. So, to believe in God, we must accept that morality is subjective. If we believe that this means relativism, and that that is no morality at all, then we have to accept that God is amoral, just as the theists accuse the atheists of being. If we accept that subjective morality can be absolute, then we find that God's being good is no longer entailed by the definition. That is, God's goodness is no longer necessary, but only contingent. So, when we apply the problem of evil, we find that it cannot disprove God under this definition, but only leaves us with the conclusion that God is evil. Under the second definition, if we maintain moral realism, then the only way to continue believing in God is to start chipping away at the definition. We must lose the first element. We may then question if a God that cannot be the creator of all things can also be called all-powerful, so this too must go. It also leaves the definition open to the problem of evil, so to survive, the fourth element must be lost. This leaves us with a being that may have created some things, is powerful but not omnipotent, is all-knowing, but is also quite evil. On the other hand, if we reject moral realism, then we can keep the first three elements, but we must lose the last, leaving us with a God that is our creator, is omnipotent, omniscient, and evil. Nice options, no? Until my next program, my regards, Filebus.